Welcome, everyone. I'm Raymond Wolfgang, and what you'll hear today is a presentation on something that was at the International Symposium last year. And it's a technique that I think a lot of people have some grasp on, but maybe you haven't formally looked at collaboration in your workspace. Perhaps you've been in places where you have some rework that you've been saddled with, and maybe you're thinking to yourself, gosh, this problem probably could have been avoided if so-and-so had talked to this other group, or if only we had the latest version of the interface document. I'm talking, if you're in an engineering situation, there are things that can actually be adjusted in the culture of an organization to reduce that rework. Now, we'll always have some mistakes. We're all human, but there are ways to cut that down. So if you're on a program where you're just beset by, where's the right drawing, where's the latest version of this, I think the ideas in here could help basically get your programs back on track and on schedule. Now, the other part of this brief, a large part of it, is not just sort of telling people collaboration is great. It's more that we lay out a 7-step process. You'll recognize it. It's a little bit like a Cotter's change model, but we have a change model that will just give you some steps to take. That you can go back to your group, your department, or your team, and just try some of these. Change is hard, particularly cultural change. That I think we all understand, but I want to also leave you with just some steps and some ideas to, whatever would work in your group. A sequence in actually changing something rather than just something that's a bit of a flash in the pan. I think we've all seen those. I remember a couple of years ago we had this big effort for a particular it was an FMEA related endeavor, and it was great. For system engineers this was super, but somehow it felt like it came, at least to me personally, as briefly as it left as quickly as it came. Now, there's plenty of formal scholarship on complexity. That is not this brief. What this is it's the fruits of a cohort. So INCOSE has a technical leadership institute, and they're opening up applications soon. Reach me on LinkedIn. There are LinkedIn announcements. I can forward the information there. Nominations go through the chapter, but I was in cohort 6, and these are my colleagues. That's just our experience. What have we found works? What have we found that doesn't really resonate? And then what's not really needed? And can we simplify something based on our experience? So again, recommend that program, but that's the group that created this effort. As information about myself, you're welcome to download the slides. Bottom line, if you want follow-up, email. I tend to be on LinkedIn quite a bit, so that's also a good way to reach me. And I'm happy to answer some follow-up. All right, so we'll lay out a little bit more what we've talked about the problem statement. The goal is we have these programs, and it's just we have rework that we should avoid. And I have one colleague since passed on, I'm afraid, but he complained about he built the same power supply 4 times. I don't know if it was 3 or 4, but that was a situation where now you're cutting metal and you're just generating scrap. Particularly if you're on the commercial sector, scrap, put a little line through the S and you get a $sign. That's a big deal. So it's a big deal in my space. I do more government defense. We're trying to reduce scrap as well. But if that's the problem, the innovation here is mixing collaboration, which I think most people can appreciate and hopefully have experienced, with this systems thinking. Okay, so there's systems thinking, which is a little different than collaboration, and then baking those two into just some cultural traits so that you don't need management to just drive this all the time, and or you don't need a end-to-end full digital ecosystem, which would solve some of these problems. A full digital ecosystem does drive some collaboration in itself. A lot of us, me personally, I think we might be a few years away from that. So in the meantime, baking things into the culture where it becomes self-sustaining, there we're going to get the results. Now, one caveat, anything worth doing is, of course, worth overdoing. A colleague, Ryan, actually brought this up. You can overdo it. You can over collaborate. If you have designers who need to just go off in the room, they have their requirements and do their design. The goal is not to bring them into 2 hours of meetings a day to talk about, the customer needs. So there is some discretion here. That the engineering part of this is not to go nuts. We'll move into the phases like we discussed, then finish up with, just some enablers and barriers. Many you'll recognize, then to wrap up. Now, the saying the world is more complex is cliche, but you might just think of your programs that you work on, and then think of the same things you were working on 10 years ago. I would submit that we're just working on larger and larger and more complex problems we're trying to solve. I work at Sandia, and we're very fortunate to have these large programs, that the nation trusts us with, but they're complex. We touch a lot of different institutions. There's not just the engineering, but there's the logistics involved in some of these large systems. I think gone are the days where you have 5 people in the room, they're all in the same building, maybe the same floor, with some drafting tools. So we're proposing that as a bit of a mindset shift here. We're different approach where, there's no one chief engineer who can keep it all in his or her head, so things are distributed, and just to build the system that works in the end of the time and the money. Time and money are done, and we have a system that once you integrate it, it actually works. There's a next level of collaboration, and that's needed to pull it off. Also, more and more engineers need to have the systems thinking mindset, and we'll go more into that. Now, let me, the definition itself, this definition will help. We're doing the lambs and roads. This is, they came up with this a little over, maybe about 14 years ago. But it's the collaborative systems thinking as basically it's people have a systems thinking approach so that they're thinking broader. They're asking, what does my product touch? Who needs to be aware of it? And I'm limiting it to technical here. Certainly we have to keep in touch with finance and other entities like that, or possible risk, the risk group. But this is more to get the system to work. Who do I need to reach out to? And if you're working on an ASIC chip, a systems thinking question might be, all right, well, let me make sure I have my environments, or, how will this be packaged and transported? Is there some other behavior that's not, writing VHDL that I need to be aware of in my design of my product? You could read it there. But it just considers all the different parts and who touches what. Now, collaboration, I think we understand, but to really to make it into a collaborative systems thinking culture, which is a thing, we're calling that an entity. That's when you have systems thinking, you have this approach, this knack, as it were, to think systemically, and then it doesn't help if you think systemically and you just don't want to communicate with people, or it's just hard to pick up that 10-pound phone or type that email. It takes some initiative, and I was pretty introverted at a time, and I hesitated emailing people because I thought I was bothering them. All right, well, it turns out we needed to collaborate because they were working the component and I had insight into the customer needs. So it's the collaborative aspect, and then with system thinking, and then moved into the corporate culture. So it might look like a big ask. It is not as difficult, I will propose, as it may seem. And for adopting it, okay, let's say we're going for all three. The culture, systems thinking with the collaboration. It helps to take a technical problem that's an exemplar. Let's take those power supplies. Okay, so my friend, he built the same power supply a couple times. All right, well, that's a rework. That's a technical problem. That could be a good intro to discussing with management. Hey, we're really on a complex project here. It's not just throwing up a cheap satellite. There are a lot of different parts there. Then we can propose, all right, well, systems thinking, here's what that is. And if we roll this out to the line engineers, we're going to have people naturally ask the right questions and say, maybe not so much with configuration management, but you're building this power supply. You can ask, okay, well, do we have the power budget? Who has the power budget? Am I sure I have the right requirements? And on some level, am I sure I have the right drawing? Do I need to talk to configuration management? Or, honestly, before I left school and was working as an engineer, I didn't know who a data lead was, or the information management lead. Okay, so I learned that once I was on the job. Simply knowing that position exists is an example of systems thinking. And if it becomes natural to sort of, everyone would know who the information lead is, and you would never think of going rogue or just storing something on your hard drive. Now all of a sudden we're getting into the culture in the right direction. So it's introducing the mindset that's new to some people, and we need to be gentle, of course, as we're rolling out something new. And then for deployment, now we've got steps, maybe a sandbox item, or if we do the power supply, maybe it's bringing people in and saying, okay, well, we're going to teach people systems thinking, and this is how it works. Then we sort of grow the training base. Now, when you hear training, you're correct, and that means time and resources. So that's where we're headed. However, the money we save can be substantial with regard to, just some training budgets and educating some people. Now, again, whenever I try to lead something that even remotely smacks of change, I got to lead with the problems addressed and what's the benefit. Now, I think on this call, a lot of people would appreciate interface management as being beneficial. Okay, so and change is not bad. Now, let me caveat that. Particularly in government and defense, customer comes down with proposed changes reasonably often, and sometimes later in the program that might, be most prudent, but they happen. So the benefit of a lot of this is that if change does occur, it can propagate through, even if it's outside of a formal systems engineering process, or our systems engineering management plan says we're done with requirements. But if we have new requirements all of a sudden, with a little more systems thinking, and it's really just an approach. It doesn't cost any money to change one's approach. So it might cost training to teach them what that approach should be. However, with that approach, you can say, okay, here's a power requirement. Mike needs to know it. Drafting needs it because we're going to need a bigger capacitor, let's say, for our power supply, and maybe a bigger cable. So it helps during testing, because then if some weird if a test fails, that you can communicate with the engineers rather than just elevate to the management where maybe they can't interpret a test failure. Perhaps you've seen, I remember one time there was a test that failed, and it was a big deal. It was a highly visible requirement, and it turns out the requirement was overspecified. So the part would have met the need, but it looks like you got this big failure here. It was a safety requirement at the time, and it was just a big mess. So you can reduce some of that mess with this. Then for design, you're always working to the right drawing. The PM part is more, you can help control costs. That comes back to minimizing rework. And the other thing is that the subsystem designers, they're not afraid to ask questions up the chain. By the time you get to a subsystem, hopefully your requirements are pretty mature. Sometimes they're not, or sometimes the test fails at a subsystem level. maybe in an informal test, and could be a problem or not. So instead of just sort of sitting on it, with this approach, the action would be, hey, we'll just call the engineer, and there's no fear of fear of judgment, recrimination, and then you can have this conversation and handle something in 10 minutes instead of having 3 weeks of meetings on it. Okay, so the part now, let's see, let me open it up actually. We're going to move into sort of ideas on just starting to introduce this mindset shift into an organization. So we'll go through that. We'll try and give you some real tips. But is there any questions? And you can unmute and chime in on the collaboration part, what systems thinking is, and the collaborative systems thinking culture. I just want to make sure we're solid on that. Okay. Okay, then. All right, I'll move the chat over there just in case there's. So best thing real time is to unmute. I will keep an eye on the chat, but a lot of times I might be a little bit of delay responding to that. So, all right. Now Cotter has 8 stages. We boiled it down to 7. For any kind of cultural change, again, there will be a request to management for resources for training, and every once in a while, sometimes maybe take a subsystem or a component that's doing well and say, all right, we're going to try adding these techniques. People sometimes get scared that that's going to add schedule. That's why we kind of want this queue up, where it's awareness and documentation, capture the current state, so we can articulate, here's where we're at, here's where we think we could be with a little more systems thinking, a little more collaboration. And, then we could avoid these problems if we had this. And my experience with management has been, if we can make a return on investment, a value add, argument, then most people I've worked with are very much open. But we need to communicate in those terms, in my experience. Then we'll move into with that, you can move forward with some small pilot projects. And that might be as simple as orchestrating a new set of meetings where you've got, systems, and then some subsystem designers, and then some software coders all in the same room. And it might look a little informal, but then we're just talking about different design issues. I've actually tried that on a current project. At first it looked like, oh gosh, another meeting, but it turns out it's really facilitated communication across some levels where we had struggled with that in the past. Now with any new change, there's the methodology, and then what we're talking about here is not a systems thinking methodology, but just a plan in bringing some training. How are we going to introduce a little bit more of collaborative systems thinking, and then again another plan of are there ways we could sort of bake this into the culture. There are always going to be barriers, so we need to look for those remaining gaps, and then of course once people see the benefits, to orchestrate some kind of training plan, and how will this not just be some finite project that ends and then everyone goes back to what's comfortable, and I've gone back to what's comfortable, just sitting at my desk, doing most of my work, and I have the requirements, and okay, I'll take the requirements at face value and do what I need to do. So this is what's coming up. Now, for awareness and documentation, what would help here is that there might be a groundswell of feeling that things could improve, or there's something that's even the management sometimes will say, what, we feel like we're either behind schedule more than we should be, or that there's something not quite right. So there may be in your org already, either a feeling or kind of a history of recent, errors that maybe could have been avoided. Don't think you're starting from scratch necessarily. However, for this phase, it very much helps to document, the current state. Is it I could do that with a survey. I was on a project, actually a current project, I'll just keep things general, is they brought in an external facilitator, brought in someone from the local university, and she basically held these focus meetings. I think there were about 6 of them, where they just got people's opinions on how's the program running. Could it be better? What's going well? What could be improved? What specific actions would you recommend in the next 6 months, 1 year? So those types of things, you can pay someone to come in, and gather the data and give leadership a report. So that's a lot easier than just saying, hey, we ought to have another series of meetings. And what we really need is a shared model where we have a common, you'll recognize this, we have a common model and we'll put it on a digital ecosystem. First question is, well, what's wrong with how things are going? I mean, it takes a lot of work to fire up a digital ecosystem. There you go. So if you could get document gaps that people are complaining about, basically capturing the pain point, you're going to be in good shape for phase 1, and you're going to basically use that throughout the rest of the endeavor. So. Now, phase 2 hangs off of that, particularly if you have a survey, if you bring in an external person. We were investigating the current state. And again, here we probably do collaboration. We probably have systems thinkers, and there's a good chance that it's not called that. We have a technical lead who is very good at seeing the broad picture. Another thing is to just ask, as part of the survey, to say, do you feel you're a big picture person or more of a detailed person? Okay, well, if you can identify the big picture people, now they're a good sandbox or a good pivot point to start telling them, hey, this is what systems thinking is. You might do it already. So takeaway here is, we do need to investigate and then document the current state. What that'll do, it'll help our case to management, and we might be in better shape than we think we are. So, all right. So with that, let's say management says, all right, well, if it feels like there's areas we can improve upon, let's go forward. Let's check this out. So now it's a sandbox. So we have some small component. I used to work on some components that equivalent would be, think of a motorcycle tire, your car tire, and you have a valve, the air valve. Okay, so I worked on a part, it was similar to a valve. And that's a nice self-contained part. The technology is pretty established. That would be a good early adoption piece to sort of try some of these techniques. And there are plenty of techniques to sort of introduce systems thinking. It's not just bringing in training, but you could do structured problem solving. I had a very good experience with a design FMEA, where you do the fault modes and effects analysis procedure on the design, look for flaws. And the good part of that is we got a list of flaws we needed to work on. That process does a risk balancing so that the highest risk items come up on the top or have the highest number, but also got everyone in the room, those with doctorates in chemistry to do the airflow, as well as the system engineer and the qualification engineer. So I'm sorry, the verification engineer. So the exercise of going through that DFMEA was a collaborative, systems thinking endeavor. You pull this off, get a few victory. Now you've got something tangible, not just to show management, but also peers, because some colleagues, you'll find are very much excited about saving time, saving money. If something's going to work, then let's put it in. But if we want to scale it, if we want to really put it through a large part of our organization, now we're talking, what is the methodology? What's the plan that we're going to do a rollout for? Because in a way, it's like rolling out a new project management system or a new MBSE tool. Saying it has to happen is bold, but it's urged to have a formal plan where, we'll have meetings and communication, and then along with the training, then even the software licenses, procuring, 100K worth of software seats, that's got to be planned. It's helpful. This is driven by systems engineering. If it's driven by kind of a peripheral group or a group that's somehow not tied to line management that leads to an executive, sometimes it can feel like it's, a bunch of outsiders telling us how to do our job. All right, that's not the case, but we're messing with culture, we're messing with people's identities and how we feel important. So tinkering with that requires some depth and being aware of feelings and all that. So, but please hear that behind all this. And I have made that mistake in the past. I have ignored other people's feelings. I thought the wisdom of the solution would carry itself. You can imagine how that went. All right, well, once we've deployed, we've got some buy-in, we've supported, let's say we've invested, we have some new exercises, maybe we've been approved to train people in design FMEA, and we're going to do it for 80% of our products. Still going to be barriers, and it's not, and just because someone resists doesn't mean they don't see a flaw in our system. So again, the takeaway for this one is, barriers are not bad, and sometimes it's a barrier for a reason. Now, change, of course, has, let's see, not everyone is going to want to change, even if we make the logical argument for it. So those barriers, need to be negotiated. Sometimes you just go to management and say, hey, management makes a decision, cuts a memo, and then you're walking around with a memo in your hand saying, hey, we've been told to do this. I recommend that as a last resort, but sometimes that's needed. That's usually needed at the very end to win over the final strikers. So, however, we just troubleshoot these as they come up. What are the objections? And particularly if it's a seasoned, multi-decade employee who's very skilled at power supplies. Again, we're not trying to steamroller everyone, trying to elicit people's wisdom to show where are our own blind spots. When we're rolling out something new. If we roll out something new and we ignore resistance, then people, get forced compliance, keep their mouth shut. They're waiting for the wave to pass, and then they're just going to, quote unquote, go back to their day job, which is not what we want. And just final thing, having some quick wins, even in this phase or the one before, can help too. People want to know, will this work? In fact, I was talking MBSE in my current project, and there was some hesitance about, hey, we're midway through. If we adopt a totally new tool, is that going to cost more time to set up than we'll win back? And then they're responsible. So I had to respect that. So anyhow, all resistance is not necessarily bad. Once we're working on some of these barriers, we're also going to be exposed to what's this gap. Example here would be we set up this new meeting series recently, about a year ago, my current project, and we feel we've got the right people in the room, but we might find that actually for a while, for the first couple of months, we were not inviting one group where it was more of a maintenance group, a maintenance sustainment group. And we realized if we're talking design, we need to bring in the sustainment folks to just see what we're doing and just kind of flag us if this design is somehow not sustainable, or somehow they will need data to do their statistical maintenance analysis. And if we're not collecting that on the front end, it's going to be very hard to get on the back end. Okay, and then the good news is we're now having that conversation. What do we collect? How much data is too much? Can't give them everything, but we also can't just give them nothing. So that's the example of a gap that we're going to find out that really only after some of this is implemented. Some of this is very hard to predict. So, but and then we just work it like we do the barriers. Work it one by one and chip away. Some tools I like in particular. I love these lunch and learns, kind of lunchtime training. We have some internal training at lunch in a requirements working group. I can tell you more about that later, but that's that group. We have people from facilities, from different business areas at Sandia, and it's just this venue where we just share lessons learned. Like for instance, we have a certain requirements tool, been around for a while, and there are some things we should not do for this tool because it'll just make it crash. All right, no one gets hurt, but it's massively annoying. Well, this community of practice now transfers that lessons learned to the new group where they're just starting their program, and now they can literally architect their systems engineering management plan or their requirements plan to avoid this sort of pitfall that is just going to drive people nuts, but also just waste time. Communities of practice are great. But there are other ways to do this as well. If you had a really nice centralized database. In fact, a friend of mine used to work at Lockheed Martin. This is secondhand, but she said that Lockheed had this lessons learned database, and that there was a formal step where a new project manager for a program would get a lessons learned brief, and they'd be briefed line by line, each lesson learned from the past program, within the first few months of starting, and simply had that forced collaboration. They were briefed on the old lessons learned. So that's another way to fill a gap. And honestly, that was helpful because the old project team did not have to be around to brief the new project team. You had a corporate archive storage of the knowledge, and you lose some things, but at least you didn't have to be co-located as well. So okay. Finally, once that's working, then we've got to that 80% mark. Nothing will be perfect, but now, let's say, for instance, in Lockheed, they have a formal process where in their engineering procedures, one of the things on their checklist is brief the new PM on lessons learned. Okay, and someone makes sure that's done, and they attest, yea, verily, I received the lessons learned. This motivated the PM to not repeat said lessons because that's where the value add came. You're not making the same mistakes over and over. But it's baked into the policy and procedures, and no one would really think of, what, I'm not going to do the lessons learned meeting. That's dull. They're not engineers or something. No one would think of doing that at Lockheed. They'd be brought in, have a coaching session with the manager. So does take training. Training takes money. There are systems thinkers who don't know they're systems thinkers, but then there are people who maybe need to be taught, what is this and how to just ask the right questions. 2-day training may go a long way, but that's got to be budgeted. That's got to be orchestrated. If the training budget's, threaten to get cut, which happens a lot, then it's back to the business case. Like, hey, we save all this money by having this systems thinking culture rolled out. Took us a while to build this culture, and you got to feed it. If you don't feed culture, you have the second law of thermodynamics for program management. Entropy builds, and then people revert to, and I do it too. I revert to how I'm incentivized. I revert to hitting the deadline, and hey, I met the requirements. I did my job. Now I try and avoid that, but left to my own devices, I might fall into some bad habits. So continuous improvement. Uh, Having a learning culture, having an R&D environment is also helpful. And then the final thing, I mentioned this new tools. I had good fortune. I had a colleague bring in a class on a modeling tool. It's a common one many have heard of. And it's going to be 4 or 5 days of just sitting there learning the tool. All right, well, it's 4 or 5 days of project work I won't get done. But this is where the leadership can come in and say, hey, look, we realize there's the return is bigger than just losing someone for 5 days. And it's just an investment. But it's the continuous improvement, the training, it is an investment. This is a bit much, particularly if you want to stick into the culture. You can't just ask people to take it out of hide or do it on their own time, or all of it on their own time. And and then if management pays for it, and people can do it during the day. I've found people are pretty open to training if they're willing to, if you can do it during the day and they don't have to take vacation. So. Now, so we've gone through kind of a collaborative systems thinking culture, and you will get progress if you just boost your collaboration. And if you just sort of train people on some systems thinking, and maybe your pain points, how things are screwed up, that was clearly not systems thinking, that you can get far that way. I would encourage that the two can, not only are they different, but they can coexist. And then they can work together. They're not quite the same thing. But don't think that you got to do the whole collaborative systems thinking culture just to get any kind of return. In fact, you may just want to start with a little bit more collaboration and then build up from there. So now the things to look for. So I'll start with the barriers on the right. If you see these things, then you could probably benefit from this more collaboration, systems thinking, or just the whole collaborative systems thinking culture, and take steps to just get it all in one swoop and fix the systemic issues. If heroes are rewarded, they come in the last minute, they architect it, they take over the design, they hit the schedule. If that is lauded and praised, and it should be praised, but if it stops there and no one asks, okay, how did we get here? That's a hero culture. That's a flag. If teams seem fragmented, not necessarily located differently, but they're just, you have the same meeting, let's say it's a bi-weekly meeting, and the same 3 people never show up. It's just not above the line for them. Okay, well, that's a fragmentation. Depending on their role, that could be an issue. Overly aggressive time pressure. Now, we all have to hit a schedule. We all need to deliver, but if it's obscenely out of balance time pressure, and schedules that are not resource loaded are also a flag on this, then people will just detach from anything new, and they'll just get results. They'll work for outcomes simply to show that they're working for outcomes. That short term, sometimes that's needed. Doing cultural change, especially when it's going to take more time up front, because this collaboration, it might feel awkward at first. That becomes a flag, and then it becomes a barrier to sort of fixing the real problem. So, and then we've experienced, well, we've done it this way and it's worked. And what I hear a lot more is that, well, if the customer was unhappy, they'd complain, and the customer is basically happy with us, and we're still getting funding. And we want to finish on time for them. They have to have it on time, or they have to have this scope. So we know how to hit our current marks. So we're going to do it the old way, and then maybe in the new project we'll think about it in 2 years. Okay, well, that's a barrier. It's not necessarily a bad thing, because the old way has evolved for a reason, but it is a barrier to sort of rolling to this CSTC environment, where with going in that direction, even though it's a little slower up front, that can, again, solve the real problems downstream. So those are flags. Now you see a little bit of hero culture. It's not panic. You might still have a lot of collaboration there, But if you see these consistently, then what you're working on is a lot more expensive than it needs to be. And if people start working, consistently working these long weeks and making, personal and family sacrifices over an extended period, then people get toasty. Then they don't report mistake. What I've seen is like, oh man, I don't want to report a mistake because, oh man, that's bad news, and then things don't work. So now, then on positive, move to the enablers here. If you see easy communication, okay, and in additional communication, if you see communication safety, and I didn't put it on the slide, but Vital Smarts, Crucial Conversations is a book on this. If you see people speaking up for controversial either events or situations, a test failed, we really don't think this design will work, or the cost profile, but we just can't do it for that cost. We're just going to need to 2x it. And then that's welcomed. They're not chastised, but that kind of risky comment starts a conversation and is engaged with. That's a sign of communication safety, because you can say almost anything and at least be respected. That's a good sign. When you hear different opinions around the conference table, around the meeting room, another good sign. And even beyond that, if you could just sense an acknowledgement that these other subsystem teams exist. So for instance, I was at a meeting somewhat recently, and we have a team lead meeting, and we talk about different items, and it's like, oh, you know what, that's a software issue, and that touches on networks. So you know what, this decision we just made, we'll need to tell Bill and Pete, making up those names. Okay, well that shows situational awareness of who else needs to know this little tidbit that came up at a meeting, that, oh my goodness, that's how it works, or that's what we need to do. Okay, that's situational awareness. And if you can find that in a lower level component group, lower level in the architecture, that might sound like, oh, you know what? I wonder if this requirement can vary. I need to call so-and-so at the next assembly and see that. So you have situational awareness both ways, but if you can see that, and it is just you can see that in what questions people ask, what comments people make. And part of this, and certainly in the early stages to assess where we're at, just takes listening to what people say, and the kind of things that are on their mind at meetings, or in the office, and even if it's a thinly veiled complaint, like, oh, so-and-so, or this or that, at least they're aware of the different pieces. So anyhow, the action here is to look for the enablers and barriers in your own group, and just get a feel, or also, again, try not to be negative and realize, hey, you might be in better shape than you realize. All right, so now the advantage of the Tech Leadership Institute is we have these workshops, these TLI, so community workshops, and we have one. It was November 9th, I think November 8th, to cover the different time zones, where we just brainstorm all of this. Okay, so we had probably about 20 people at the workshop all together, and just different thoughts. We went through the phases. What's collaboration? What do you think systems thinking is? And we've had a good experience with a product called Miro. It's like a large whiteboard where you can have multiple editors. And we'll summarize the results here, but if you want to know more of that, let me know. We can go through sort of what was spoken there. And this is good insights. There's a lot of comment. But the takeaways there, what will help us is that if the collaboration is good, it can be overdone, but in general, collaboration is good. Certain tools can automate certain collaboration. For instance, for power supply, if you had running it off of all one big large model, you could solve some problems with a technical tool. But the cultural itself, then that's tricky. That involves a little more concerted effort. So It's not something you could just direct top down. And honestly, people have conflict with colleagues at work for whatever reason. There's rooting for different sports teams, as petty as that. I haven't seen a whole lot of that, but that type of conflict can come up, and that'll drive some of this. So, small steps can really work. Even just using the collaboration tools, firing up a small meeting series where it's just a tag up meeting. So these, even though it's tricky, it doesn't have to be a complex solution. The point, of course, is to avoid preventable problems. That was viewed pretty consistently as, hey, why should we even do this? And that it's not a substitute for doing the engineering, budgeting appropriately, giving people enough time. It's not a cure-all, but it can certainly help. And then to really drive it home, this can't be ad hoc or seat of the pants. There's some concerted effort needed. At first, it can be grassroots, enough to sort of convince management this is a good return on investment. It's value add. At first, it will seem lean, but long term, it'd be hard to make the change without not just management on board and allowing it, but also driving it and saying this is how we will conduct business. Any questions? Which means you've probably seen this from the other slides, but it can be hard work. Making change is hard work. People know this on the call. However, the good news is it is doable. And it also does not all have to be done in one swoop. We have proposed a phased approach. Cotter's model also shares a phased approach, but it's certainly doable. There is benefit to it. And to drive this is the other thing, to drive a collaborative systems thinking culture, to do systems thinking or to roll something like this out, it doesn't necessarily take, a master's degree in a traditional engineering science, whether it's, mechanical, electrical, human factors. It doesn't take that technical background necessarily to do all this. So the relationships remain important. Even in a post-COVID world where things are hybrid, that's the risk of a hybrid environment. People can just feel isolated. We have a woman working in Seattle. I'm based in Albuquerque. My project's in Albuquerque, and she flies in once every other month, and we're very engaged with meetings. But we need to actively make sure she's included because she has a very important role in the larger program. Then the rest of the time she'll do her work, she'll lead her team, and that takes care of that. So, and finally, for changing culture, we behave as we're incentivized. If you want a reference for that, I can give you that, but what are the cultural incentives? If we roll this out, but then the hero culture is so rewarded, with promotion and status and cachet, that then the incentives are fighting our effort. So part of rolling out this culture, getting the benefits, is we got to look at these incentives, because if left to our default, myself included, we behave as we're incentivized. The good news is that's also fixable just by changing how things are rewarded. And there, in particular, management needs to be involved. But just changing who gets promoted, what gets noticed, who gets assigned prime and desirable roles, what behaviors they exhibit. That all drives culture. People see that, and people adopt accordingly. So it's hard work, and it's very doable. It's also worth it. And with my own experience with different groups, maybe yours as well, you probably enjoy the ones where there's a little more collaboration, where ideas flow. After the forming and storming part of team building, getting to that norming level, can really make engineering a great field, and system engineering as a rewarding part of that. And finally, while we're doing this, the upside is big. Ultimately, we do all this because it's more efficient in delivering complex products to our customer. We're always asked to cut development time. And it's not just a tool or a technique. When I use the word mindset, the systems thinking mindset, an instinct or a bent toward, collaboration. That involves a little vulnerability. If those who remember David Long's talk of the 6 T's and 3 V's, one of those was vulnerability, and that's involved here too. So this is not without risk, but with that mindset of being okay with that, now all of a sudden we find out the test failed early enough to fix the design, or we find out that doing the math, we have the lead with 3,000 hours for a year and everyone else with 800. All right, so that's going to popcorn someone's head. So in time to fix it. So that's the other catch. And to quote Michael Jackson's song, I believe it was "Man in the Mirror." If we want to bring this to our workplaces, we need to look at ourselves. Are we collaborative by nature? Are we adopting systems thinking? Is it part of our own fabric before we try and introduce it out into the world? Ladies and gentlemen, please, what's on your mind? What do you think?
First, I just want to say thank you, Raymond. That was really interesting. So I'd certainly like to see. Are we trying to put that into practice at Sandia? Do you know? Or
well, honestly, we had great luck. We faced on this project I'm on, large program, and we just had trouble getting things from the systems level out to not just major subsystems, but out to the components. And there'd be a system level issue. We'd come up with a low level design fix. And then, you can't drag a coder in all these systems meetings. You won't get any code written. So we struggled with how do we promulgate that? How do we sound the trumpets and get that information out consistently in a system? And what we came up with, we fired up a different series of meetings. It's a type of systems meeting. And then we just say, hey, either your lead or a POC needs to be at this meeting once a week, 2 hours, so we can really get into some good discussions. And then with that, we have a very formal action items and decisions list. So we have actions, we have people, we categorize it. We give access to the spreadsheet. It's in a common location. We push out action items. I personally do follow up with individuals on their actions, and they're grateful. They're grateful. Oh yeah, I'm glad I found that out. And same thing with decisions. List of decisions, categorize them, we date them, we tie it back to the meeting minutes that the decision was made at. Because 6 months later, I forget it, and we just have this. It's all Microsoft Excel, but we just have this formal process to where we come up with things. There's some way, give it a couple of weeks, it'll percolate there. So it can work and doesn't have to be expensive, but it did take our lead engineer, our senior person, saying, I'm chairing this meeting. This is how we're going to do it. And, and he's a credibility to do that. People listen to him. So.
Thank you very much.
Knock on wood. Wish us luck.
We do. Questions, you can either unmute yourself and talk, or you're welcome to type it in the chat.
So while we think of questions, let me just start out. One item someone did bring up was how much collaboration should you do versus let's say you're on a very constrained budget, you have a tight program. I've heard of things where they spend all the money planning. So the question is, how much do you collaborate? How much do you not? When's that diminishing returns? What we concluded was it does depend. Certainly for tighter programs, what we suggest is just if front load the requirements. I'm a little biased, but there, if we can establish sort of requirements up front and they're refined and maybe even do quality metrics on the requirements to really lock them down, that would buy down the risk of just giving the requirements to the designer and saying, okay, design it, you have 4 weeks. You can reduce, let's see, the more problems your front end work has, your concepts, requirements, the more collaboration you're going to need downstream to iron out the confusion. So you can buy down, you can, let's see, if you want to reduce downstream confusion because you just don't have time to do all this collaboration, then front loading some of the engineering work up front can still give you a working product, because at the end of the day, the customer just wants their problem solved. So that question came up in the past.
Any more questions? People are really quiet tonight. Sorry, Raymond.
No, well, we're still coming off the holidays, I think, so.
Yeah, you're standing between me and a beer with my working group, so.
Oh, dang. All right. Well, there's collaborative. Well, Cheryl, I'm glad you mentioned that, because collaborative systems thinking activity does not have to be within the workday. And one of the things with Sandia, we have a production agency at Kansas City. We produce a lot of parts there. And sometimes the tension is high. I mean, it's no one's fault. It's just there are tough problems. But when we go up there, we, particularly for a review, we'd all go out to a restaurant or something and then get to know each other socially. That was extremely helpful, because when we're back in 6 weeks, we know Bill or Pete or Judy. And because we, shared a little bit at the restaurant, we had a beer. Sometimes we had 2 or 3 beers, calling an Uber, getting home, of course. And, there's just that rapport, or that at least a mutual respect, where you can go and say, hey, look, what's your no kidding date where you can get this tester done? And then and honestly, work can get done. And this is even more important if you have a requirement change for the production agency. They hate those, rightly so. Being able to negotiate that, it takes some amount of collaboration, and a lot of that can happen over a beer. So, or the beverage of your choice. I should say that.
You are correct. We do find that as well. Are there any questions? If not, I will give everyone back some time. And I want to thank Raymond again so much for giving this talk. It was very well attended, so I really do appreciate that.
Okay, well, thank you, Cheryl. Let me just add another bit of value, hopefully, for this theme. There's a bit in the NCOSI Needs and Requirements Manual that we just released this document a couple months ago, version 1.1. Go deep in section 2. I'll point it out if you want. There's a bit on collaboration and requirements development and analysis. So if you're talking hardcore requirements analysis, systems engineering, collaboration is there, and systems thinking is there in the mix. So if you want to deep dive on some literature, there's that. If your company is part of the NCOSI corporate advisory entity, you can get the document for free if you're an associate member. So if you're www.ncosi.org, click join, see if you might be eligible for a free membership or a free associate membership. It's not a full. You get some of these other guides that will give you a little more detail. So.
And Raymond, we have a question that did come in. Judy C was asking if there are any thoughts on whether it might be effective to introduce training earlier in the 7-step process.
Yeah, I would drive with the pain point. So if you have some screw up on your project, something where, oh man, we should have caught this, you can always back up and say, well, what training, if it were in place or if it had been in place, would have helped the individual who was just doing their best. You can't be judgmental in this. Would have helped that individual avoid this problem. Okay, so that you can do a quick turnaround and propose a training to solve an immediate need. But But honestly, even if you could just point out a general, the program ought to be running better, just jump on a training suggestion there and say, well, maybe just people just don't have the systems engineering process down. Actually, Dr. Druin brought in a training course not too long ago to address some concerns there. She brought it in, and I believe it was very well attended. So if you can make an argument that, hey, this training would help earlier, then boom, I would jump on it. And then you can build from there. So
Thank you. Any more questions?
Judy, I struggle with that too, making the case for training. So if you figure this one out, let me please share. That's a good one. Sorry, Cheryl, go.
I was just asking if there are any more questions, and I wasn't sure if someone was trying to speak up. No. All right. Then I will say good evening and thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Raymond, again.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. That was great. Follow up as you need. I'll be around. Have a good evening.